The spiritual ego uses spirituality and spiritual beliefs as a kind of fancy hat that they put on in order to further decorate their sense of self. And we use this fancy hat of spirituality as a way to separate ourselves from the non-spiritual people. We wear the spiritual hat as a way to stick our nose up in the air and say, look how awake I am. Look how wise I am. Look how connected and in tune I am. Check out my giant crystal collection. Check out these spiritual healing powers that I have. Look how awesome I am. So the key insight here is that the ego naturally, when it grabs hold of spirituality for the first time, it naturally uses it as a fancy hat to further decorate itself and to further do its egotistical things. So on our planet today, more and more people are having spiritual awakenings. And spirituality is becoming more and more popular, and it will only continue to grow and expand. As we are starting to see the limitations of capitalism and rampant materialism and pleasure seeking, more and more people are awakening to our internal spiritual nature, which is absolutely amazing. And that is exactly what the planet needs more of. More compassionate, caring souls who are connected to their deep inner wisdom. So that's awesome. The issue is that it is unavoidable that when the ego first stumbles upon spirituality, it almost always grabs it and puts it on like a fancy hat and says, hey, look how spiritual I am. Look how woke I am. And it tries to use this fancy hat to gain influence, to gain status, and to gain respect from other people. And I'm definitely guilty of this. I've spent years doing this, and sometimes I still do this. Which is why I'm the one wearing the hat. All right, so the purpose of this video here is that we are going to go into the traps of the spiritual ego, because the ego does a super good job of corrupting spiritual teachings, which is exactly what we're going to talk about here in this video. And I'm going to go inside and set up my camera, and we'll talk about that more. Yes. I can feel this bowl cleansing the energy in my heart chakra. How divine. All right. So we're all set up here. I got my altar with my crystals and my Buddha and my candle, just so you guys understand how spiritual I am. And also we're going to light a little piece of sage so that we can cleanse the energies and begin this transmission. Okay, guys, on a serious note though, I love singing bowls, and I love sage, and I love meditating, and I even like crystals. The problem is not these things. The problem is that when you are identifying with these things, the problem is when you are attached to these things. The problem is when you need sage to purify your energy, or else you have a panic attack. Or the problem is when you go out to the store and you buy 20 crystals because you think somehow buying a pretty rock is going to change your internal state and your internal beliefs about yourself. Here, the reason why understanding the spiritual ego is so important for your personal spiritual path, and also if you're someone who wants to be a leader and maybe you want to be a spiritual leader, or maybe you want to be a thought leader, and you want to help other people elevate their consciousness, then you must understand that as our culture becomes more and more infused with spiritual ideas and beliefs, as the years go on, in 2021, many people are having spiritual awakenings. And as a collective, we are awakening to our spiritual nature, to our connection with the rest of the universe and the rest of the globe and other people. And this is super beautiful and important, because this ignites your inner compassion and your curiosity for life, and it opens your mind to new ideas, which is so amazing. The problem is that in almost all cases, when somebody has a spiritual awakening, they then use that spiritual awakening and then they identify with it. So a spiritual awakening, normally it lasts a couple minutes, it lasts a couple hours, maybe you do some mushrooms and your heart gets blown open to all of the wonder and beauty of the entire universe, and you feel connected to God, you feel connected to the animals and the rainforest and all that stuff, and that's awesome. The thing is that these spiritual awakenings, they don't last that long. And in almost all cases, life and your habitual conditioned mind then starts to reform, and the ego structure comes back. And what you believe you are is now you believe you're a person who has had a spiritual awakening. And then you start to identify as being a spiritual person. And you actually use that to define yourself and what you believe you are. And then you maybe watch some spiritual videos or maybe read one or two books. And then you start to develop all these ideologies and belief systems and mental ideas for how you think the universe works. And then you become very rigid and attached to these belief systems and ideologies, which is why having arguments and spiritual disagreements is so popular. And this always happens in spiritual communities. All right. And the spiritual ego is going to be the source of many societal problems in the years to come. Because the truth is, spirituality is an extremely vast ocean of a field. And it's extremely complicated and complex and difficult to wrap one's mind around. In fact, spirituality and enlightenment is even more difficult to understand than quantum mechanics or than rocket science. Because the ideas here are so subtle and they're so paradoxical and twisted that the average person who first stumbles upon the spiritual path falls into all the traps. All of the traps of identification and judgment. And we're going to go over all of the traps that, or not all of them, but we're going to go over the most important traps that spiritual people fall into so that you can recognize it in yourself, which is key because all of us have some type of spiritual ego, myself included, so I'm not immune to all of these traps. I've fallen into all of them myself, which is why I'm able to actually share them with you, because I observe my own spiritual ego, and we're not judging it here. We're not judging spiritual egos. We're just trying to understand how it works so that we can move beyond it and avoid the traps and also help other people avoid the traps as well. Otherwise, there's all sorts of spiritual warfare and spiritual scamming and rigid ideologies and belief systems and quackery like people doing healing sessions, but they have no clue what they're doing, and then they think they can heal someone's cancer just by doing some Reiki, which works sometimes, but a lot of the time that person just needs some damn medicine or something. All right. So the spiritual ego causes all sorts of problems, and here are the main traps that the spiritual ego falls into. So first of all, the main trap here is that the ego identifies as being a spiritual person. And as I touched upon at the beginning of the video, the point of spirituality is not to put a fancy hat onto your ego. The point of spirituality is to completely destroy your ego, to obliterate it, to realize that your sense of separation is a pure story. It's a fiction, a mental fabrication. However, many beginners, myself included, don't really realize this fully. They might understand it conceptually as an idea, but they don't actually understand it. They don't actually embody it. All right? And Ramana Maharshi said, your duty is to be, not to be this or that. All right? Because when we identify as a thing, it's like, oh, I'm a Reiki healer, or I'm a spiritual teacher, or I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Christian, I'm a spiritual person. When you're identifying with a thing, that is ego. Because the truth is, you are nothing. You are the entire universe. You can't be one thing, because that would exclude all the other things. So when you say I'm a Buddhist, what you're saying is that you're not a Christian. See, that's not actually true. You are every single thing in all of existence, because you are empty awareness. You hold space for all things to exist within you. You are literally every single thing and none of them at the same time. Which is why sounds crazy, but spirituality, it's so complex, so difficult to understand, which is why I spend hours and hours explaining it here on this channel. The key here is to watch yourself. Don't identify with being a spiritual person. Just watch for your identifications. All right. The next trap is the spiritual ego likes to judge other people and likes to judge objects or places as being not spiritual. The spiritual ego likes to look at a factory that's dumping waste in the water, and they say, oh, those greedy capitalist pigs, they're not spiritual. If only they were just as spiritual as I am. If only they went to Burning Man and smoked weed and did yoga and connected to their heart and lit some sage. If only that, then all of the problems in our society would be solved. So we judge other people. This is completely normal. When you begin the spiritual path, you are thrust into this world full of new ideas and new crazy beliefs, and we start to judge other people. So for example, let's say you start to become a vegan. You have a spiritual awakening, do some mushrooms, and you realize that you shouldn't be eating animal products. All right? Great. That's a very noble thing to do. The problem is that what almost always happens is not only do you stop eating animal products, but then you also judge all the other people who are eating animal products. And you say, these people are so asleep. These people are non-spiritual. These people are just blind sheep. All right? And whenever you are judging another person or another object as being not spiritual, as long as you're saying this thing here is spiritual and this thing here is not spiritual, what you're doing is you're creating a duality. You're saying that reality is not one, you're saying that reality is two. Reality is made of spiritual things and non-spiritual things. And this is a complete fabrication. Reality is non-dual, meaning everything is one. The factory dumping toxic waste into the ocean is just as spiritual as meditation and lighting sage and using Reiki and crystals. And until you can see that the factory dumping toxic waste into the ocean, or the people who are clear cutting the Amazon are just as spiritual as the people who are going on meditation retreats, until you realize that, you're lost in spiritual ego. You're giving preference to one part of reality and you're hating another part of reality. This is why the truly awakened masters, they talk about unconditional love, which means it's without condition. You love the factory that's dumping into the ocean just as much as you love the people who dance in the forest and hold hands. All right? It's crazy. It's crazy stuff. A lot of the things I'm going to say in this, I'm going to continue to say. If you feel that they trigger you or they set you off, just notice that. I might be poking some buttons here. Next, the spiritual ego loves to create a rigid ideology and belief system about their specific way of seeing reality. The spiritual ego reads one or two books about spirituality and then thinks that they have all of reality figured out. The spiritual ego will think about the astral realms. They'll think about meditation. They'll think about the third density, the fourth density, the fifth density. They'll think about spiral dynamics. They'll think about the planes of consciousness. They'll think about all sorts of new agey ideas, and then they'll think that they have all of reality figured out. They'll think about past lives and paranormal phenomena and angels and guides. See, here's the thing. Reality is a lot more complicated and paradoxical than you think. And you can't really understand reality unless you're reading hundreds of books, unless you're willing to surrender your own attachments to your pet theories and ideologies. So sometimes I talk to spiritual people and they tell me about all of their spiritual ideals and beliefs, and sometimes once in a while I just like to question them. Just to see if they're actually attached to what they're saying. And what always happens is I'll question them, I'll poke a little hole. It's like, oh yeah, Adam, I went to the store, I bought these crystals. I'll say, hey, why'd you buy those crystals? You do know that crystals are completely useless, right? I'll say, Adam, you just don't understand. You're not as spiritually awake as I am. You're not as attuned to energy as I am. I can feel the crystals. You can't because you're just stuck in your mind. You're too busy just thinking about stuff. See, this trigger, this reaction is because the ego is actually identifying with a belief system. In truth, there is no such thing as a crystal. It's an idea in your mind. It's a story. What's the difference between an amethyst and a quartz? Damn, crystals are super beautiful. I like them. But I also realize that they're made of my own consciousness. This crystal doesn't have any special powers that my own consciousness doesn't have. I am giving this crystal power by believing that it has power. That's how the mind creates reality. You believe something that you heard from somewhere else, and then that thing becomes true to you because you believe it, but you're not actually aware that, crystals don't actually have powers. You made it up. And the same is true with if you do a psychedelic and you come across a demon. A demon comes and they try and possess you. If I had $1 for every time I had spiritual people messaging me and talking to me about how they did a psychedelic and then a demon came and tried to trick them into killing themselves or something dark and twisted like that. I don't know how to tell these people that that demon is you. You actually are that demon. It's not some separate entity that you have to be afraid of. The fact that you're afraid of it means that you're not actually understanding that everything that occurs within your field of awareness is actually you. Just like in a dream, right? So if I talk to a demon in my dream, I am that demon. I'm actually creating that demon with my mind because I'm dreaming. You ever seen a monster in your dream? See, if you're in a lower state of consciousness, you think the monster's separate from you. But once you have a lucid dream, you have an awakening, then you see that there is no separation between the monster and me. My mind is creating the monster and this entire dream landscape, including my idea of a separate self. The spiritual ego doesn't understand that. And that goes into the next point where the spiritual ego is very materialistic and is focused on external spiritual objects like crystals or rituals or specific important places like feathers and idols like Buddha or like the cross like Jesus. The spiritual ego, which isn't just New Age people, but of course it's also religious people, have a massive spiritual ego. It is always focused on external objects and is not realizing that these external objects are just made of your own consciousness. So whenever you become attached to paranormal visions and spirit guides and Buddha and statues and giant holy places and sacred buildings, you're just becoming attached to your beliefs about spirituality. You're holding your beliefs as sacred. And if you question a Christian about Christianity, they'll get all offended and triggered because the ego is getting defensive, because the ego doesn't want to be exposed. Now, you can really tell if someone is acting from a place of spiritual ego versus whether actually genuinely being like an awake human. The main difference is that the spiritual ego really likes to flaunt its spirituality, especially when it has something to gain from it. Personal gain. So for example, the Bible says, don't pray in public, pray in secret. What that means is don't flaunt your spirituality to other people. That's something private that's within you. And of course, if you can still help people, you can still offer guidance on the spiritual path. But the second you're using spiritual insight and wisdom as a way to manipulate other people into respecting you, into trusting you, so that maybe you can sell them a product, or so that you can convert them to your ideology. That's how you know you've been corrupted by your spiritual ego. So a good question to ask whenever anyone is giving any spiritual advice is, what does this person have to gain from being so spiritual? What is their agenda? So, for example, my girlfriend just got a new job where she's working at a float tank place. If you know what float tanks are, those sensory deprivation tanks where it's kind of like a capsule from like a sci-fi movie, and it's filled with water. And what people do is they sit in the tank, and the water has a bunch of salts in it, so you float on the top of the water. Then they close the lid, and it's like you're basically floating in nothingness, and you can't feel your body, you can't hear anything, you can't see anything. It's just pure black, and this is a really relaxing thing to do. I've never personally done a float, but I imagine it's really, really nice. Now, as you can imagine, this type of place attracts all kinds of spiritual egos. All right? And my girlfriend used to have a giant spiritual ego when I first dated her. She's a tarot reader, and she's very psychic, extremely psychic. She is an empath and taps into other people's energy and is good. She has prophetic dreams and is able to read the future and stuff like that. But when we first started dating, she was very, very attached to her spiritual ideas, right? And if you're dating me, then all I do is just question and poke holes until eventually you're like, oh shit, Adam's right. But that's because of just how I am. I'm a philosopher. But anyways, so her boss, for example, just discovered spirituality a couple years ago. And apparently, he has a lot to gain by acting spiritual, right? So my girlfriend's telling me that she knows he doesn't actually understand the deep core of spirituality, like the fact that you are literally one with the entire universe, and that you don't exist, and that everything is made up of your mind and your own consciousness. He might understand that, but he doesn't really get it, because he's still talking about, oh, the devil was trying to tempt me, but then, you know, I don't let the devil tempt me. See, it's hogwash. It's bullshit. But this person still puts on a spiritual front and still acts spiritual, because this actually gains him a lot of respect from the other people who walk into his float village place. All the other, you know, spiritual women, and they're like, oh wow, you're so spiritual. It's like, wow, you're awesome. And they trust him, they trust his advice, they think he's, you know, some type of spiritual person, even though, yeah, sure, he is. I'm not taking that away from this person. I'm just saying that the ego has a lot to gain from acting spiritual. All right? And if someone was really invested into actually understanding themselves and the universe, which is the main motivation of true spirituality, then they would go on a long ass retreat and just sit there in an empty room and be super uncomfortable for a long time and actually question internally. But no one wants to do that. It's a lot easier to look at some videos of spiritual people on Instagram and then just absorb their beliefs blindly and then identify as being a spiritual person. All right. The spiritual ego likes to reject other paths. The spiritual ego likes to say, my belief is the best belief. Christianity is the best. the one true way. Islam is the best. Everyone else, they are the infidels. Only the Muslim people know the true spiritual wisdom. All the other paths are diluted. Only my spiritual path is the best. Classic spiritual ego. So, I wanted to tell you a story about Giordano Bruno. He was a heretic back in the 1600s, where he was someone who spoke against the corruption of the Catholic Church. Giordano Bruno was a mystic and a sage, and he actually genuinely cared about spirituality, and he spoke out against the corrupt Catholic Church that was taking bribes and was having women and was using all of their influence to control and manipulate people. Giordano Bruno spoke out against that, and they actually burned him at the stake. So in this example, Giordano Bruno is being spiritual even though it is against his personal gain. So he had something to lose. He literally got burned at the stake. See, that is an example of someone who is being spiritual but is not doing it for egotistical reasons. Whereas the church, right, who burned Giordano Bruno at the stake, they thought they were being spiritual. They were saying, "Oh, this guy, he's a heretic. He's corrupting the minds of the youth. We need to burn him to save our sacred path." See, that's not really being spiritual. That's spiritual ego. Because obviously the church knows that it's being corrupt and underhanded, but it doesn't want to admit that to itself. So it's a lot easier to just burn all the people who disagree with you instead of actually self-reflect and reform your own system. That takes a lot more emotional effort than to just murder everyone who disagrees with you. All right. The spiritual ego tends to do something called spiritual bypassing, where you use spirituality as a way to ignore all the other practical aspects of your life. I'm definitely guilty of doing this. For example, like law of attraction. Many people think, oh great, spirituality, the best thing ever. I can just sit on my ass and do this visualization meditation, and then all of my desires will magically just flow to me. And I don't have to lift a finger or do any work. I don't have to learn about business. I don't have to learn about relationships. I don't have to read difficult books. I don't have to actually research. All I have to do is just sit on my ass and just imagine how money in abundance is flowing to me. And that seems like a great shortcut. That's an easy way for me to hack the universe. But obviously this is the spiritual ego, because the truth is, if you want money in abundance, you need to learn how to acquire that for yourself. That requires investing money in books, courses, seminars. You have to actually educate yourself. Or if you want, a relationship to magically appear, then you need to spend a lot of time reading books about relationships. You need to go out there. You need to put yourself out there. You need to actually make an effort instead of just sitting on your ass and visualizing, right? Now, visualization and law of attraction, that's a useful tool in addition to actually working towards your goals. But many people do spiritual bypassing, where they use law of attraction as a way to skirt doing hard emotional labor. Many even spiritual masters do this, where they invest all their heart and soul into spirituality, which gets them into a super awake state, but then they don't know how to make money, or they don't know how to market themselves, or they still have shadow material that they have all types of hang-ups and emotional trauma from their past that they think can be solved by just meditating more, but actually they need to maybe do some shadow work. Maybe they need to see a therapist. Maybe they need to journal about it. Because as we've seen over and over again, just meditation alone doesn't help you heal your past trauma and your shadow side. It does help a bit, but many spiritual masters, enlightened masters, still have tons of judgments and demonizations of other cultures, and all of that is coming from internal shadow blockages. Also, sometimes we fall into the trap. I used to fall into this trap a lot, where we say something like, oh, reality is just an illusion, so nothing matters. My girlfriend would tell me how she feels, right? She feels angry about something. I say, babe, it's all just an illusion. Don't worry about that, right? That's actually a form of spiritual bypassing, because I'm basically just ignoring the problem, right? Yeah, everything is an illusion. That's true, but it's a real illusion, and you still have to deal with it. This is the only thing we have, right? So by saying reality is an illusion and then just, sitting on the couch and just eating Cheetos, that's spiritual bypassing. The spiritual ego loves to do that. All right. Let's take my notebook over here. The spiritual ego also forsakes and abandons society. I've seen this one so much, where spiral dynamics stage green people, really, if you want to learn a lot more about this topic, you need to learn about spiral dynamics. Okay, which is another principle. The spiritual ego doesn't understand spiral dynamics, and that human beings go through different levels of consciousness, and that stage green, which is the spiritual new age woohoo stage, which most people are awakening to from stage orange, most people don't realize that stage green is not the highest stage, and there's plenty of room for growth above stage green. So you need to actually commit a good 10 hours to studying spiral dynamics, where you can actually go on actualize.org and check out Leo's spiral dynamics series. I made a little intro to spiral dynamics, but it takes a lot of work and energy to actually make the entire series. So I do plan on completing that, but slowly. It's a lot of work. But luckily, Leo already completed the entire series, and he has hours and hours of content explaining spiral dynamics, which is essential for you to understand if you want to avoid all of these traps, if you want to understand human beings and the evolution of human consciousness, and you want to actually grow past being a new age spiritual person who's completely lost in spiritual ego. All right. And of course, all the higher stages like yellow and turquoise, they still have tendencies to fall into spiritual ego as well. But stage green is like the main one. All right. So a lot of this video is more than just a rant against stage green. But if you understand that distinction, then you'll grow and learn a lot about what I'm talking about here. So stage green and the spiritual ego likes to abandon society. They like to say, oh, look, our whole society's fucked. Everything's all corrupt. The people are all asleep. They're all smoking cigarettes and eating meat and corrupting the water. Screw that. Let's all just go live in the forest and start a little forest tribe community where only the woke people will go live together in our little forest community, and then everyone else is going to die. COVID's going to get them, or whatever bullshit excuse that they have. I've seen this a lot, especially during the COVID scare. Many spiritual teachers or leaders, they started talking about how, there's the 3D reality, which is where everyone is asleep, and then all of the woke people, all of the people who follow me and watch my videos, they're gonna move into the 5D reality, which is the reality of unconditional love and peace and enlightenment, and we're all gonna ascend. But all the people who believe in COVID and the government and whatever, they're gonna stay stuck in 3D. And all the reptilians are gonna eat them, and then Bill Gates is gonna inject microchips into them. Many people actually believe this shit. And if it's not that extreme, there's still forms of it where the spiritual ego wants to separate itself from all the asleep people, and then to go live in some utopia land where there's only woke spiritual people. But the problem is that that's not actually sustainable. And you're not realizing that you are not fully awake unless you actually help everyone ascend their consciousness. Using spiral dynamics, which is actually the main way you do that. Now, the last trap of the spiritual ego is that, I've heard this so many times, I don't need to read hundreds of books because I'm in tune with my own internal wisdom. And Adam, you're telling me to read all these spiritual books. I don't need to read books because I get all of my wisdom from source. See, no. The only way you can get all your wisdom from source is after you read hundreds of books. The problem is that unless you actually educate yourself about enlightenment, spirituality, personal development, self-actualization, the whole world, relationships, money, career, business, all that stuff, until after you educate yourself about all that stuff, which involves reading hundreds of books, only then are you able to transcend the mind and not rely anymore on external wisdom coming from other sources. This is a phenomenon where Stage Green tries to pretend that they are at the final highest stage, which is Stage Turquoise, where Stage Turquoise transcends the mind and goes beyond thinking and duality, in theory. But Stage Green doesn't realize that they're not there yet. In order to get to Stage Turquoise, which is the highest stage, they have to move through Stage Yellow, which is in between Stage Green and Turquoise, where Stage Yellow involves actually building a conceptual understanding of how reality works by pulling from and reading from hundreds of different sources, by expanding your horizons conceptually. Stage Green thinks, I used to have arguments with my girlfriend and her friends. They would say, "Oh, Adam, you're just too stuck in your mind. You're too reliant on other teachers' wisdom. You're not able to just tap into your own internal wisdom." See, no, that's not actually true. My own internal wisdom is telling me that I need to read hundreds of fucking books. And if you think you don't need to read books, or you're beyond reading books, or you're too spiritual to read books, you're completely fucking deluded. Totally. And you're bullshitting yourself and other people. There's wisdom in books that people have labored for hundreds of years to learn, and you think you can tap into the nuance and detail of a book just by listening to your heart. There's no fucking chance. There's no way. Alright, so Stage Green and the spiritual ego generally isn't multi-perspectival enough, and they don't see the value of studying hundreds of perspectives. Alright, so let's the last quality of the spiritual ego is that the spiritual ego is easily triggered, and it's easy to trigger them, right? And maybe you can sense for me a little bit that I'm getting a little bit triggered when I think about the people who aren't realizing that you need to read books in order to grow as a person. See, I'm not immune to the spiritual ego, and it's actually something that is still alive in me, and it's just good to understand that that's okay, and it's just good to actually observe the process. See, so the spiritual ego is easily triggered, all right, in all ways, shapes, and forms. When the beliefs are questioned, they get triggered. Or when people are eating meat, or when people are polluting the environment, or when people aren't being multi-perspectival enough. Easy to get triggered. All right. What is the solution to spiritual ego? Well, we just already touched on it. We're going to observe our own tendencies and resist the trap of judging and criticizing all the people out there, but we're just going to observe our own spiritual ego tendencies, and you can observe them in other people as well. But we're not trying to judge them, we're trying to just be curious about them. And we're actually taking this attitude of curiosity. Like, the spiritual ego is so interesting. It's so cool. It's so ingenious, the way it functions in so many twisted and backwards ways. It's so interesting to see how the ego completely corrupts and twists spiritual teachings to serve its own agenda. Observe that happening in the world and also in yourself. Now, the main way to go beyond spiritual ego is to realize that your thoughts are constructing reality. And I have many other videos explaining this in a lot more detail, but realize stuff like crystals, stuff like rituals, and blessed ground, and demons and angels, and spiritual meanings of numbers and symbols. Yeah, so all of that is real on the relative level, but just be conscious that you are creating the meanings of every single thing that you see. So the ego likes to say, oh, so this crystal has power, and that crystal has nothing to do with me. It just exists separate from me out in some external world that is actually real and physical. And that this crystal actually has its own power that is separate from my own awareness. The main trap of the spiritual ego is thinking that the world actually exists outside of you, and that you are not involved in the process of actually creating existence and what it means. So observe, realize that all meanings, stories, beliefs, symbols, and objects, all of them are created by you. So when you look at an amethyst and you say, oh, amethyst, that helps boost wisdom. Or you look at a what's the other one called? A smoky quartz, like, oh, that helps clear negative energy. Or a shungite helps protect against this. See, all of that is made up. And so is the entire world. So is existence. So is your personal story. So is the fact that you were born. So is the fact that you're a biological human entity. So is the fact that you are a spiritual being having a temporary human experience. All of that shit is made up. And it's just important to recognize that. And the best way to recognize that is to do mindfulness meditation, and to check out, I have another video where I have a bunch of videos actually where I explain this in a lot more detail, the fact that the mind creates reality. So check out those videos. I'll link those videos. Do mindfulness meditation. That'll help you detach from your thoughts and to realize that these thoughts about spirituality and Reiki and healing and Christianity and Buddhism, all of that is just thoughts, and all of them aren't actually real. You also have to read a lot of books, read about enlightenment. You can't understand spirituality without having a good conceptual understanding, which many people ignore. You got to be able to let go of your pet theories and ideas. Don't be rigid and cling to one idea. And also, you need to be able to love everyone. You need to be able to actually look at a capitalist who is polluting the ocean or cutting down the rainforest and actually love that person. You need to be able to look at a criminal like a murderer or a rapist or a drug dealer and actually genuinely love that person. Are you able to do that? Because your love is not tested by you loving your brothers and sisters, or you loving, your spiritual in-group. Your love is tested by your ability to love people that you hate. Can you love people who go against your own personal beliefs and wants and desires? Can you love a capitalist that's polluting the ocean? And the way that you love is by increasing your understanding of human psychology. You need to actually understand, why is the capitalist polluting the ocean? What kind of ecological systems are in place that make it so that that capitalist actually has to pollute the ocean so that he can win over his competition? You actually have to understand the systemic problems that are causing everyone's behavior. Why is this person a murderer? It's not because he's a bad, evil person. It's because our system is so toxic and is so diluted and corrupted that it creates human beings who think that it is okay to murder. That murderer, he probably was raised in a toxic family. His dad probably beat him. He probably got scolded by his teachers in school. He has no access to higher consciousness information. How do you expect him to live? How do you expect him to make money in a conscious way without murdering other people? All right, so you love the universe by understanding it, and that is what the purpose of this channel is about here. I am extremely interested in understanding human psychology, understanding collective dynamics, understanding my own spiritual nature, understanding the actual structure of consciousness and of existence. And as I build my own understanding by reading hundreds of books, doing psychedelics, doing meditation, learning, talking to people, going on retreats, as I do all that stuff, I learn a lot, and then I share that with you guys here. That's the purpose of this channel. Stay tuned. Check out my video about how to go beyond mental constructs so that you can go beyond the spiritual ego, and also check out my intro to spiral dynamics if you haven't already. And otherwise, stay tuned, and I will see you in the next one.